You can only be a chief because there are followers. So the work of leadership includes followership because you are continuously following others because you have to enable them. In the modern sense, we think the power lies in the position, but the Batswana understood that the power actually lies between the two parts of this equation plus God, who essentially decided that you will be one of us that leads us.
Hello and welcome back after a short break. I have the pleasure of introducing my dear friend George Mutenda Zamera, and he lives in South Africa and also always one leg in Zimbabwe. George and I, in fact, met on the ICW sessions, never met in person. Why I'm referring to this is that I mean, just being ICF coaches and just being ICF members creates so much of foundation of trust that across borders, across continents, you form instantaneous friendships. So that is how George has been a friend of me for last many years. We ran a podcast called Jay and George for a while, and George has been with the industry for more than 25 years. A lawyer by profession, practiced law very intently for the first 10 years, and I think then also led the businesses. He's taken up to coaching a few years back. He's very, very active on the startup scene in South Africa. He's been the past vice president of the Professional Speakers Association of South Africa. And if I'm not wrong, I think he's currently the president of the same organization. Extremely active in helping the startup ecosystem, women entrepreneurs across Africa, and a very active member of ICF South Africa. Josh, please add if I have missed out on anything.
No. You have everything there. Thank you very, very much. It is an absolute honor for me to be here and to participate in this groundbreaking conference. I think you've done an excellent job in getting everything together. You say in 60 days, I think you said. Well
Yes.
done and congratulations. Yes, today really we are going to be going a bit deep into the paradox of power and leadership. And I would like to introduce Dr. Mongezi Makalima. And I'm going to read his bio because it's rather lengthy. So I'm going to skip some sections of it. But I'm sure if you go to his LinkedIn profile, you can see the full dossier. So Dr. Mongezi is an organization development specialist, organizational learning expert, and executive coach with 30 years of working with organizations and leadership in corporates and NGOs. He's actually one of the world's top 20 coaching professionals, and we're truly, truly proud of that. He's also one of the Thinkers 50 top 50 global coach, top 40 organizational culture champions, and the founder and president of the what we call ABCCP, which stands for Africa Board for Coaching, Consulting, and Coaching Psychology. He loves jazz music and is a board member on some of those things. As I say, go to his bio. But he is currently the chairperson of ABCCP, and he holds a BCom in industrial psychology and business management, an MBA through the University of Northwest, an MA in coaching psychology, work-based learning from Middlesex University in the UK. In the UK, he's got a PhD in organizational psychology with a focus on leadership, professional credibility, and as well as postgraduate certificate in group process consultancy. I'm reading all that because it really resonates with what he's going to be talking about, his experience and the things that he is done. So please help me welcome Dr. Mungezi Makalima, a really renowned coach, and we have nuggets that will be shared across the globe this afternoon. This afternoon here, I think, is this evening where you are in India.
Ah, there you go. Thank you, George. Right. So, do I continue?
Yep, the floor is yours now.
All right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. As you have heard, my name is Monges Makalima, and with all of the stuff that George has said, I think there are three things really that are an essence of me. I'm an African, I'm a leader, and I'm an elder. I'm an African because I wake up every morning asking, how do I put Africa at the center of the world where it's supposed to be? And I think part of this work is really part of well, being here is part of that work, really taking what's great in Africa to the world and what's great in the world to Africa in this instance. I say I'm a leader, and it's not also only because of those positions that sitting on all of those boards and all of the stuff that I've been doing for over 3 decades that Georgie has read, but it's mostly because I don't wait for things to happen. I make things happen. I get in trouble a lot. So, and today I might say some things that maybe people don't agree with, but I think at the end, uh, one of the things that I've learned from a smart man is that if you are a leader and you're comfortable, you're probably not leading, you're following someone else. Um, Lastly, I say I'm an elder. Um, Something that now I have earned, as you can see, all of these grays that have showed up, but uh, I'm raised as a Motswana. So where I come from, eldership is not about age. It is about uh, uh, thinking about how do you bring how do you create a future that's different for those that come after you? Different, hopefully better. In this instance, I say to people, I raised 9 kids by the time I was 12, and definitely not none of them were mine at that time. But it's a choice you don't have when you grow up where I grew up. So that's me in a really big nutshell. Um, and thank you, Jayshree, for the invitation to this conversation. And I see there's been a number of very interesting conversations, including the one that just ended now on AI, which is quite a fascinating conversation to be having. And interestingly, as an aside, I just created a fascinating an app on AI because I'm a technology person. So I'm not afraid of AI, but I think part of the conversations that we've been having, particularly at the ABCCP, has been about what is the role of the human as AI is coming through. So that's part of those conversations that we're having. But today, uh, I'm not really here to talk about that. I think Jay, we met a couple of years ago, and one of the conversations I was having at that time was about the whole concept of um, the whole concept of what do they call it? The imposter syndrome. So I was so, and then when we met for this conference, and she was saying, "Okay, what would you talk about? You should talk about this imposter syndrome." Like, what? I know other things, but but she felt it was a really important conversation for leaders, for us to have, particularly from a leadership perspective. And I thought, actually, maybe you are right. Let me have that, but I want to juxtaposition it in a very different way, in how it might show up, particularly from a Batswana perspective, which is the tradition within which I was raised. So I'm not speaking here on behalf of all Africans, but I'm really speaking particularly on behalf of the tradition and of the Batswana within which I was raised. So I don't have a presentation, so I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to have a conversation, and I hope it's useful. So I recently published a book, which had been a long time coming. I think for a couple of years, um, I've been working obviously as in leadership, and as I was observing and working with leaders, I kept making notes of some of the learning learning pieces that I was coming across. And one of the things that I started doing is start exploring leadership from the Batswana perspective. So when you're raised as a Motswana, but I suppose in any tradition really, you learn to speak in proverbs, because a lot of the wisdom that lies within communities sits in proverbs. Many people, there's all this whole myth that there were no schools in Africa, um, and education only started um, with the Westerners, which is kind of false. But um, part of it was that there was education and there were schools, but a lot of it was a lot more for the elite and the chiefs and the kings who would go into a whole formalized education system, even if it wasn't necessarily like what it looks like in the West. But for many of us, ordinary people, a lot of the learning, a lot of the books were short piety sayings that summarize the learning and the knowledge and the wisdom within the communities from those who observe and put that knowledge together. And one of the things that is fascinating with Proverbs is around how they also have a bit of a paradoxical um, a piece around them, where um, they could be saying something and then feeling like they're saying something else. So depending on how you are engaging with the paradox, you could make a point for or against. And I think the work of the of the proverb is not about being for or against. It's really about provoking a thought and creating conversation of learning around a particular statement that has been made, a philosophical statement that has been made. So I wrote a whole book there called "This is not a leadership book, but leaders can read it too," because I didn't really intend for it to be a leadership book, there was a lot around that, and that was leadership. I've put a link to that book on Amazon in the chat. So if anybody is curious about it, it's a nice little small book with about 10 of these proverbs that I took and how they apply in the modern life today. And then I took modern situations to put it. So a modern situation that I wanted to apply to it today, as in the context of this conference, um, is the whole concept around the leadership, the paradox of power that comes with leadership, the imposter syndrome, so to speak. Because many of us and many leaders in this room would know this, that you get promoted into a leadership position, and then it is this position that now all of a sudden there's this expectation about how you're supposed to be. There's an anxiety that you feel that you take up for yourself, because really, in as much as we go to all of these schools to learn about leadership, nobody really teaches us how to be how to be leaders, except experience. The experience of leadership is actually much more different than anything you learn. I have 2 master's degrees and a PhD, but every single time I get into, I have to make a decision. Yesterday, I was sitting with my team, for example, and I was going, I'm so tired of making decisions. And then I kind of had to just let them think a little bit and then focus a lot more on vision and the future and where we're going. So nobody really teaches you how to be a leader. And the Batswana actually have then a way of speaking about this concept as well, which is contained in a book as a proverb. So I'm going to say it first in Setswana, and then after that, I will translate both literal as well as maybe connotative, and then we can have a bit of a conversation about it. So in Setswana, there's a proverb that says, Kgosi ke kgosi ka Malata. Kgosi ke kgosi ka Malata means a king is only one because there are followers. you can only be a chief because there are followers. Meaning, first of all, part of the paradox there means you can call yourself a Kgosi. You don't make yourself a Kgosi. It doesn't matter how uh, how much you have been born into chiefdom, because many of us, of course, would inherit the chiefdom. But if you don't have the respect of the community within which you inherit that chiefdom, nobody really cares. And it's actually fascinating how I've seen it play out quite a bit in many of our tribes and our groups, where it even ends up where the rightful heir to chiefdom in terms of the wisdom of lineage do not actually end up taking up the role um, as a de facto leader, because the community doesn't actually take up the idea of this person, and they don't approve, in inverted commas, of this person as their chief. So you are a chief without followers in this instance. And therein lies the paradox in this instance, because the imposter syndrome then that if that emerges in that space is that, first of all, you are the one that there is a projection of power and competence and capability and everything great in terms of the name chief or king, induna, or whatever it is that they will call you that indicate your level of superiority or elevation above everybody else. However, that having been said, uh, it doesn't mean you control, first of all, the people. They give you the right to actually rule them. And this hasn't changed. This actually is the same even today. Many times we go into elections, we elect people, and then they come into positions. In many traditions where the power of the authority of the chief and or the authority of the president, authority of the prime minister, authority of the premier is respected that flows from the traditional cultural framework of that group. Singapore is a perfect example of this, for example. And you find that the community and the people in that space, they really let the chief just get on with it. They let the president, after they elect you as a president, they let you get on with the life of having to do the chief things, right? And this is the function that the community Malata, and I'll speak a little bit about this Malata thing just now. The function of the followers is to get on with their lives so that they can essentially make sure, because they know, because they know that they have put someone there, whether you're brave, whether you make decisions, whether you are wise, whatever reason they put you there, they trust you to deal with that. It is then amazing when you think about the modern sense, where um, the, the trust in leadership, where it has um, reduced. It is mostly because many of the people that we then allow to take up that role, and so that we can let them be, and then we can go and take care of our children, they don't do their jobs. But of course, modern systems are designed in such a way that those chiefs, those premiers, those prime ministers, those presidents, we cannot just pull them, we cannot just take them away. When in fact, in a traditional sense, what would be happening is that all it takes is the word, all it takes is the ceremony, all it takes is the trust of the community in you. But also, I suppose the closeness, because communities were smaller then, it made sense that people would actually be able to give you and tell you what what is happening and what they are not happy with. It wouldn't happen in the form of revolt. It would actually happen in passive resistance, in the way that people just refuse to do your bidding. And what would then go into it if you continue in that? Malata, your slaves, the people that are really are supposed to be closest to you as your advisors, will be the ones that are actually used to get rid of you. Because they have your ear, because they have your attention, because they have proximity, they would be the ones that the community would essentially eventually leverage on to get rid of you, and a coup would essentially take place in that instance. And most of the time, it's not a coup, it's death. Because in the context of Kgosi ke Kgosi ka Malata, the assumption is you have been um, you have been given that role by God. In which case, if you are not working and fulfilling that function, we might as well send you back to your God. In this instance, at least in some of the regions, that's the reasoning in this instance. So it can be quite violent in how you actually think about it. So when we think about this whole concept of democracy, this is extreme democracy in action in this instance. Now I want to shift, and I'm going to start wrapping up and opening it for conversations, because I think I've positioned the thesis in this instance. Um, the other piece that for me has been fascinating, and Jonathan Passmore and I and Badri Bajaj, I think is probably maybe in the room. I can see who's in the room. We will be publishing a book based on leadership from indigenous experiences, in this instance from across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. So as I was doing a little bit of the exploration of that, one of the things that I share as a story in that book, which might be useful also for this conversation, is my experience of the first time attending a lekgotla. In my language, we call it a lekgotla, a port, or a community meeting of sorts. I always worked on an assumption, which I think is possibly an assumption that many people have around the title of the role chief, that they are all powerful, they make all decisions, they are all knowing. So as a young man, I walk in because I kind of do come from a bit of a royal lineage of sorts, although I don't say it out loud because then I don't want to be judged based on that. So I find that I was surprised by watching how my uncle would sit in the room, flanked by two let's call them the right-hand man and the left-hand man, and they help us in that instance, the lieutenants, who, after all the ceremony of making sure that we respect the chief and the space just by their body, they are saying nothing. They're just walking in, and there's this whole ceremony around this person, and then they sit down. Once they sit down and they are quiet, the work starts. You would now be expecting that in this case, in fact, the case, I remember it very well. It was a woman who had lost a cow, and there was an accusation that there was a particular young man who had taken the cow in this instance, and there was this whole conversation around what needs to be done, because now they had now called the parents of this young man who has been suspected of this. But I'll spare you the detail of that. I'll focus a lot more on the process, and that speaks a lot more to my thesis. And what became fascinating was how quiet this gentleman was for about 45 minutes as the right lieutenant and the left lieutenant were the ones that were doing the questioning and asking questions and rephrasing, paraphrasing, reframing, understanding, probing, and he was just sitting nodding. And once in a while, when there was something that didn't make sense that the other two were not asking, he would pause them and ask that clarifying question very quickly, and then after that sit back in that body that essentially says, okay, I got what I wanted. And the conversation would go, sometimes it would go for hours, where he is very quiet. And then once everything is done, depending on how long and who has to be called and who has to die, then the lieutenants would then summarize the conversation. This is what has happened. This is what we heard, and play it back. After that, he now can talk. And in how he talks, it's not even so much, I have listened to this and you will be banished to some desert somewhere. No, it also comes with a sense of empathy that says, I have listened to this conversation. I and then he makes what I think today in modern courts we call it an obiter dictum. I think George, you probably would be you'd be familiar with that phrase. I didn't even know that you were. I've known you for such a long time. I didn't know you were a lawyer. So they would do an obiter of sorts, which is a statement of belief, a statement of summary, not so much of the facts, but so much of the sense and meaning making I get out of this situation. And having now said that, it would be said not only with facts, it would be said not only in terms of the actions that need to be happening, but also with a sense of feeling and connection to the values that are actually encapsulated by the community in that manner. So the chief really truly represented the voice of the community uh, at that point. And that becomes now the power that he has by acting back and giving back to the community the respect that the community has given to him, and using that power to make decisions. After that, he won't even make a decision most of the time. Again, depending on how bad the case is. If it's a very simple case that needs to be dealt with, and there are kind of rules within the community around that, he would very easily delegate this to the lieutenants to make. But even then, he would make sure that it is done with empathy, unless the person that is on the case or the accused is acting in impunity and they are not paying attention. So I want to stop it there, and maybe just to summarize then. Kgosi ke Kgosi ka Malata. Malata in this instance was also used by the Batswana deliberately as a word that they would have picked, because they could have said Kgosi ke Kgosi ka Setšhaba. Setšhaba is a Setswana word that essentially talks about a community. In this instance, it is a nation. In English, it would translate to the word nation. Lelata is essentially the meaning of the word lelata can be read literally as a slave. But if you read it in the context of the proverb itself, is the one that you probably would use a much lighter version, which is servant, the one who is serving the king. But the king serves at the pleasure of the community, which is Malata, but Malata serve the king. So it actually gives you that whole paradoxical relationship that says, where does the power lie exactly in this instance? In the modern sense, we think the power lies in the position, but the Batswana understood that the power actually lies between the two parts of this equation plus God, who essentially decided that you will be one of us that leads us. I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Doc. Thank you very much. I just want to add a few things around the similarity between what the Botswana do and actually the region in terms the scenario you have painted there of the court scene with the chief and the lieutenants would be you be mirrored in the Shona culture, would be mirrored in your Zulu culture. In the Shona culture, the chief is Ishewangu, and in the Zulu, it's Kgosi Yami, but it's the same individual. But here's the thing I would like us to look at. The concept brings in, you're looking at an inquiry of control and vulnerability. Who has control?
Yeah,
Vulnerability. Who has authority? And issues around influence and humility. Because in those cultures, trust is huge in placing you in a position. You
yeah,
are there because we trust you. And then the guys can literally look the other way and carry on with their business.
yeah,
Today, you are putting people in those same positions, and the culture is let's turn around and walk away. How is that? What's the word I'm looking for? How can you um, how can you relate the two? Because in the old days, when you turned away and walked away, the individual knew his responsibility based on the trust,
yes,
etc. Today,
yes,
we elect a guy from the street and we've put him there. He doesn't have the same concept.
yeah.
How do we deal with that in present modern?
Yeah, I don't even know, George, if I have a nice clean answer to that question, right? But here's my take in comparison. So, if you look at the traditional systems that worked then, and this could be obviously a subject to the environment and the number of people in the population. People knew people, so when you are being placed in that position, you're not being elected. So we are not talking about your skills and your knowledge. You are not lobbying for the position. First of all, the belief um, is that that position has been uh, has been given to you already from God in this instance, because that's also another thing, by the way. So I keep using the word God. People think that many of the Southerners, particularly, don't believe in God. It came with the Westerners, which is kind of a very weird way of thinking. So the idea is that everybody has a position that has actually been bestowed upon them by the powerful Umvelingangi, God, Mudimu, in this instance. So we know what the role literally of every single one is. If you maybe speaking particularly about your comparison into the Shona there, if you go to the Dagara people, a little bit up northwest Africa, in West Africa, there, Mali, etc. You find that Malido Masome uses the word there. He uses a phrase. He says, when a child is conceived, the community already knows what this child is there to do. So how is this different from the modern sense? In the modern sense, you have well, first of all, the number of people, there's a lot of people everywhere. You don't know who this person is. But two, um, there is someone who just comes, maybe they're not even from that community, that essentially then answers that answers the call, but might not necessarily be for the community. They are coming into the community for their own particular benefit, which has nothing to do with the community. So I think, in short, then the difference between the old ways is that we took time to actually understand who the person are, what their values are, what are their passions, motivations, who are their parents, and then we would then put them there knowing that we trust them. Now you are voting for someone on a piece of paper who can tell you whatever it is that they want to tell you because they are looking for a position.
Mm, mm. And in those times, what would you say were practices that kept leaders stay anchored in service rather than ego? Well, what we have now is egoistical beings. What practices were there that kept them anchored?
Yeah, and it doesn't mean, by the way, it doesn't mean, by the way, that if, at that time there were people who were not doing bad things. There were leaders who were not doing bad things, right? So let's get rid of that idea already about the fact that everybody was perfect. But I think the general sentiment, first of all, if I think, as Monk as Makalima, so I'm not saying it's the truth, but just as I studied as Monk as Makalima, and then I work a lot with young men now, um, who are growing up and coming into communities and growing in communities. I see that there's one part that is continuously missing in the education of the of particularly these young men, is the spiritual growth that comes with it. So we spend so much time giving people knowledge. We spend so much time talking to people, young people, but um, how much time do we spend getting people to know themselves? How much time do we spend sharing stories of heroes, that then transfers values, beliefs, attitudes around what the community is? How do we tell stories of families in communities so that these young people know who their neighbors are, know who the communities across the river and across the forest are? So I think that's the difference. The difference is the first of all the care and the deliberate work of the whole human, their spirit, their mind, and their body. Today we spend so much time just working a lot on 25 MBAs, and everybody's just driving around and speaking 120 kilometers per hour to not try to convince us that they know stuff, when most of the time they know really nothing. And if I can be so bold, I was asked. I do a program. I work with a number of people in Vermont, in the US, a project called the Hope Makers, and we meet every year to kind of just figure out what can we do for the world, to bring hope to the world, and all those, which is kind of a fascinating group of very humble people who are really very well positioned. They know, if I may use an adult language, please forgive me, I have to say this. They know shit. Sorry. And I take it back. I just had to get it out. It's people who know stuff. So when I hang out with these people, they ask me, Monges, what would you do if you had to work for free and work back or pay back to the community? It was a very interesting question. And again, I'm the only African in the room, which is always interesting for me. But then that's my job, right? Putting Africa in the center of the world where it's supposed to be. And so I said, well, I don't understand the concept of working back, because where I come from, we don't work back. We are in the community. We live in it. We are about it, which means your interdependence to the community continuously, the young, the old, the females, the males, the animals, and land, we are continuously feeding into it, which talks to that whole concept of greed and power. in this instance, you are serving the community. In fact, instead, I said, if there was one job I would do for free, is to coach the G7.
Okay.
Give me any of the G7. Give me any of the G7 presidents in the world, and I will coach them for free because I want to be able to inculcate some of those principles of to Ubuntu. I think Dr. Makadala probably has spoken about this at some point. If not, he's probably still coming. So, how do we bring understanding the whole human into the world? And I think many of these G7 presidents, they're not very inspiring for me, right? And part of the reason why they're not inspiring, what I find missing is the lack of spiritual awareness, lack of inner self-awareness. So they look very clever, they're politically savvy, and they know stuff. But what they don't know is who they are in the context of the communities within which they serve.
Two things coming out there for me. One, do you see us getting back to that kind of leader who understood his role as a holding trust on behalf of community? Do you see that happening? And secondly, if that is possible, obviously understanding that the evolution of culture, etc., over periods of time. But if it was possible, what role do you see for coaching in that regard? So can we get back there? And what role for coaching?
Yeah. I don't know if it's going back, it's getting back there, because I think we also make a mistake by by thinking we want to
Mhm.
capture what has happened, what has been. It has been. It's
Right.
a if you imagine life as a river, um, it's flowing, right?
Okay.
We've learned a lot. I think you and I sat together at some point, and I said one of the things that is always interesting when we talk, particularly as Africans, we're continuously wanting to see being African as going back to the rendezvous and the whole tradition of the fire and all of that. And I think it's ridiculous, frankly, because I think there was a lot of wisdom already on the continent that was driving a lot of advancement. Language started on the continent, and writing started on the continent, and humanity started on the continent. But the work of it is about advancement and moving forward, right? So I don't think it's then about going back. It is
Okay.
about integrating. So I remember a few years ago, I think probably about a decade or so ago, I was quite gung-ho about how do I show up as an African in the world that doesn't really respect what it means to be African. And I wanted to claim absolutely everything we have contributed to the world, from our art, from the music, from the medicine, from the science, the psychology. I mean, everybody speaks about Maslow as if Maslow came up with this stuff for himself. But if they understood where Maslow got it from, if people understood where psychoanalysis by Freud came from, so I was doing a lot of that, and it kind of was exhausting to reclaim a lot of that wisdom. Until one day I sat down and I realized, oh no, hold on, that's not what this is about. The work is about how do we own, George, um, what the West is bringing into the conversation that's good? How do we own what the North is bringing into the conversation that's good? How do we own what the East is bringing into the conversation that's good? And how do we bring what the South is bringing into the conversation that, and when I say that's good, I'm not saying good in the sense of individual goodness, but how it advances collective humanity towards the next. So we shouldn't be thinking about going back. We should be thinking about how do we advance together, using now all the wisdoms that Africa's children who left and distributed themselves across the world can come together and integrate towards mother's goodness.
All right. All right. Uh, and around the coaching, so I see that the coaching then, from what you are saying, I'm getting then the picture that says, yes, we now, coaches now can play a role in creating this new, shall we say, use the word environment or new world.
Yeah, actually, let me answer. I didn't address that. So I think from well, already I think when I was talking about the story of the chief and how they're listening,
Right.
a lot of the coaching came from here, right? A lot of the humanistic theories that inform coaching today came from this continent. Yes, there were integrations about the work that came from the East. I mean, the Esalen Institute, everybody talks about John Whitmore as the father of coaching. And I hung out with John, and John vehemently disagreed because he knew that when he went to the Esalen Institute, the East, the South, the wisdom from the East and the wisdom from the South, people like Virginia Satir and all of that, were coming together to inform him to think a little bit more about coaching, which led him to talk about the inner game as opposed to the outer game that led to us now talking about coaching today. So the work of coaches is just to be more human, more amazing, and do the work that coaching does, which is how do we tap into lighting up the human spirit continuously by being first human ourselves, because there's a lot of coaches who are machines, who are just ticking lists and going through steps and logical models and all of those things. But how do you connect as a coach to the human in front of you? How do you think about how together we advance human human progress?
That connection with the human in front of you. Talk to me about AI.
Yeah, now you're starting me, and I don't know if we have enough time, but let me see if I can summarize. And one of the things that's fascinating for me about AI, um, I mentioned earlier that I created an app very recently after I came back from the Hope Makers. They were teaching us a lot of this the technical stuff. But continuously I'm learning one thing.
Mhm.
I'm learning that first of all, in order to use AI, you kind of have to know what you're doing. So AI is a tool. 1,000 years ago, we used Word. We started using Word Perfect. I remember I started computers and starting to do word processing using Word Perfect. But before then, my mother had brought me a typewriter, right? So moving from a typewriter to Word Perfect was a transition. But did Casio writer typewriter that I was using, did it take over who I am and my thoughts and what I actually wanted to say? No, it was just there as a machine that did that. And when we moved into Word Perfect, and we moved to Word, and we moved now into whatever we all are using, because we can now talk to our computers and tell them what we want to do. As I'm speaking here, this thing is capturing my whole story, and then, but it didn't make up the story. My consciousness made up the story, but it is a partner, as I see it, in the acceleration of the work we need to do. So let's not give our humanity away into machines. I don't even think it's possible. So if you think about AI, for me, AI is you tell it what to do. I see it as a 22-year-old that knows a lot, that's very clever and very fast, but they have no wisdom.
Okay.
Our work is to bring the wisdom into the conversation.
Wisdom from the Batswana people. Yes, that is the way to go. Listen, we're being told that we're running out of time. And so, JC, if I could then hand over to get other contributions from delegates, otherwise we would hog the whole place ourselves. Oh, I see here there's a question. How do you bring some of these practices in your OD work with modern corporate?
I love that question, Jeffrey. Thank you. I think first of all, by showing up first as myself. I've had to learn to listen to that voice a lot that says, who am I in this system? Especially as an organizational development consultant, there's a lot of the unconscious and conscious stuff that are playing themselves out continuously. You could get lost in performing on the stage and taking lists, or you can use yourself to show up as giving people the example of what that could look like when you show up. So first of all, I show up as myself and then create a space that then allow people to become themselves, Jeshri. And then at some point in that collective conversation, we start reminding people why we are doing what we're having to do. So even if we came, yesterday I was working with the police, for example, locally. Um, I was supposed to be doing some work on governance. I didn't refuse to do the work of governance because it was what that was called. But first, I had to anchor it in asking them a question: why are you all here? Not why are you in this room, but why did you come into this room today? And it's a very different question. And then they said, what are you asking? I said, no, who are you? And why are you here? Why is this important? Because if you don't know why it's important, this work, for in the context of humanity, then maybe we don't have to do it. So that's my answer. I really, first of all, own myself. That gives people permission and own themselves, and then really challenge people while I'm supporting them to own themselves just as much.
And there's a question there that says, why do we separate the leader from the followers?
Yeah, Gitanjali, I don't know. I'm thinking we should be blaming the West. Maybe we should be maybe blaming Western PR. We should be blaming 1925 leadership theories that were essentially separating. But there is no leadership without followership, and I think thank God we are actually learning a lot more, especially since Warren Bennis and some of the work that people like Warren Bennis, Manfred Katz de Vries, and all of these guys have been doing, and everybody across the world have been bringing the Ubuntu-ness, the human, into the leadership since the 1950s. We're actually starting to realize that that's nonsense, the separation. In fact, I'm provoking a lot most of the time. I actually was fired at one university because I arrived there and I said, leaders are born. And, and they go like, what do you mean leaders are born? And then as I started explaining, I said, each of us has a plant that has been planted into us as purpose. We just need to find it and figure it out. And so the work of leadership includes followership because you are continuously following others because you have to enable them. But you are also continuously leading in that thing that you're leading in because you're not an expert at everything.
Does that mean anyone and everyone can be entitled to be a Kgosi? What is the criteria to be one if you don't know who the person is, especially if he isn't from your community?
Yeah, I wish I had a nice, clean answer to that question. That's a beautiful question. First of all, no, not everybody is allowed to be a host, at least according to Mongezi, because that's a position, right? But that also assumes that leadership comes in a position, and that's not really how it works. At the end of the day, each and every one of us is a Kgosi in driving the purpose within which we have been put on earth to do. Because a Kgosi is like CEO, it's like MD, it's like president. At the end of the day, those are positions. They are not necessarily leadership. You could occupy those positions and not lead at all. But leadership, everybody is not even entitled. Everybody has been given that. People just has to activate and do it. So the criteria here, if you ask, then is the criteria for the position is different because it will then be defined in a job description that's based on the values and purpose of the organization and where the organization is going within the context of where people are. But and the Kgosiness is also that. I mean, the Batswana had a way of defining it that says you are born a Kgosi because you're coming from a certain family. You demonstrate certain particular competencies like courage and kindness and humility, etc. But to be a leader is a different conversation because being a leader, you just be and you show up as who you are a lot. And it hurts, by the way, I have to say this. The reason why many people don't do it, first, because we don't know who we are, but two, it hurts to be who you are in a world that demands that you be someone else all the time.
How do we share ancient wisdom with the younger generation in a way that will be interesting to them?
Put them on their cell phones. Give it to AI. Let AI, don't let AI, let's feed this into AI. Let's use this tool. It's there. So let's feed this knowledge and information into AI. Let's create movies that they're interested. Because I think most of the time we tend to want to punish them. We tend to want to take their phones away and then let's sit around the fire. Let's talk. That is good as well. However, find them where they are. Let's put them in books. Let's put them in movies. Let's
Mm,
live it ourselves as parents, because most of the time what we tend to do is we tend to point, you do this, forgetting that these three other figures are pushing the responsibility toward us in terms of how we show up. And many people, young people I work with a lot, I actually just realized in my team, um, literally everybody other than two people are under 35. They're watching
that's
how
the key.
I show
That's
up
the,
rather than what I'm saying.
they are watching. That's very important. And they will imitate what they see.
Yeah.
How do you see the whole African community shaping up future of coaching in this AI driven environment? Where do you see more awareness and development is it where do you see more awareness and development is needed to
Sure.
shape coaching in the future?
You guys are not you
You can
guys are
write
not
a thesis on
playing,
it.
right? Thank you, Jyoti. And I think first of all, it's always interesting to start to talk about Africa as if it's just it's one homogeneous group of people, right? So, I always think about countries more than anything else. That says there are countries that are already making advances and doing very well. I think if I think about in the West, Ghana has become quite a space for technology and President Mahama, I see, is showing the leadership that is about Ubuntu and connecting and taking people along. So I think that's the spaces to develop. If I look at in Kenya, it's very different because the youth are throwing their arms around. And personally still don't believe they are correct. But the work is then how do you engage with youth such that we have a conversation that says, what am I bringing as an elder? What are you bringing as youth? Let's work together to create what we need to be creating. And so I think a lot of the work is around, first of all, people having to bridge the gap. Africa is the youngest community in the whole world. How do we bridge the gap between the the energy of youthfulness
Right.
and the wisdom of eldership so that we how do we create spaces to talk instead of shouting at each other, and then the space then of technology, because technology is always there. How do we then use technology to enable it, because technology doesn't replace humans, it just enables it.
Well, um, well, I mean, since yesterday, my role has been, like a security guard who says, "Time up and go home." For every session, I've been doing that job. But I must say, Dr. M, I think every word that you said was like molten gold. And George, you held the space so well. I think together, when we are listening to both of you, we think that we should actually be in a half a day workshop with you. And 1 hour is not enough to do justice to what we can really speak about, converse about, and maybe even, you know, um, a sum of give and take, because there are so many similarities between what we believe in here in India and what you've been talking about. But this is wonderful, and I think eldership is something. I think that concept is going to stay with us for a very long time, because it's not an entitlement, but it's rather a responsibility, and that's how I look at it. Thank you so much for taking time for this conference, and we will keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank
My
you very
pleasure.
much.
Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone
Thank
for
you,
listening.
Josh. Thanks.
Thank you very much for all your contribution. We appreciate it. Thank you.